Okay, right. I am going to make a start today. I think we might have a couple more people joining us, but we'll just give it a go, see how we get on. Right, so as I said briefly before, my name's Mel Glazard, and my experiences predominantly are in the UK education system. I started as a classroom teacher, a senior leader, before going into a role that's called a specialist leader of education. And I do that across our region and the UK. I've got other experiences where for several years I went out to the Gambia and trained teachers in the delivery of phonics as well. So we're going to get started on this afternoon's session. Now, during the course of the next hour or so, we're going to be looking at the fundamentals of teaching phonics. It doesn't matter which scheme you work with, this is information that many will find helpful. I used some similar material, just a matter of days ago, to be honest, with a group of head teachers from our area who have expertise in teaching phonics, and even they admitted that they'd learnt quite a bit as well. It's particularly helpful if you're new to teaching phonics as well, but if you're not new to teaching phonics, it's also very helpful. So by the end of today's webinar, I'll have discussed with all of you and shared the rationale behind systematic synthetic phonics, what it is and what it isn't, and the research behind phonic instruction. We're going to be looking at what systematic systems actually look like and why fidelity is important. Now, when I say fidelity, I mean sticking to one scheme, which I'll explain what the rationale behind that is, that we're not cherry picking. The fundamentals of phonic teaching, so that we've got a better understanding. And then thinking about how we can organise all our learners, our pupils effectively, and expectations of progress through the programme. We'll be looking at some do's and don'ts for effective teaching, and then you'll have time to reflect on your own setting as well. So what I'd like you to do in the first instance is just, for yourselves, obviously, create your own definition as to what you believe systematic synthetic phonics is. What is your current understanding of it? I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that, and then I'll share with you my definition. Hopefully we'll be on a similar wavelength. So what do we mean by systematic synthetic phonics? Okay, so phonics is knowledge. It's the code that allows us to read and write. So it's understanding that each of those individual symbols on a page, whichever language, English language, each individual symbol is potentially one sound, or two letters, one sound. But that when we then combine those random symbols on a page, that they form a chunk, they form a word, and that conveys meaning. That code, as we call it, I always say crack that code. If we give the children the code, they can then unlock the message that's been communicated on the page to them. Once they've cracked that code, we're then opening up a much wider range of opportunity for them. They can access other areas of the curriculum once they've cracked that code and they know how to do it. Language is key. The more children talk with adults and the more stories that they hear, the greater their knowledge of the words and of the world. Therefore, the more quickly a child learns to read, learns to crack that code, the sooner they gain the exponential growth of vocabulary. Only can they really do that if the phonic program is running alongside story time and that kind of thing, and language and communication. So, in this instance, we're going to adopt We're going to teach and we're going to understand. The recommendations are that you would adopt one phonic program and you basically stick to it. And that's what we mean by Fidelity. All of the different schemes that are out there, whether it's Jolly Phonics, Letters and Sounds, Floppy Phonics, Read, Write, Ink, we choose one, just one, and we stick to that one program. Now, the idea being, the system that we have over here, is that we teach it with Fidelity. So we don't cherry pick techniques from other programs. Their techniques have been chosen specifically for their delivery. And if we mix them, that's when we then confuse the learner. So the idea would be that you use one program, and on entry, in the case over here in reception, you would start with a program and you would carry that program on until they've completed it, generally at the age 7. So it's a couple of years, depending on where you're teaching. Different institutes, that might be different. So for example, when I've been out in the Gambia training them, they don't start any phonic teaching because the children don't start school until they are 7. But they would still take the full 2 years, if not at times a little bit longer, to complete that full program. And as in the Gambia, they use Jolly Phonics, and they only use Jolly Phonics. They follow it all the way through until the children are secure, they're safe with that code, and then they can be exposed to further material and crack it on their own. And then we're going to think about the generic principles that underpin all of the different programs. So it doesn't matter which one you're using as an institute or as a school today, because the principles for all of them are exactly the same. They might look slightly different, but they've all got the same end goal. So we have to think about that consistency and continuity. Whichever scheme you've chosen to follow, it's important that all adults in your facility are delivering that same program so that we've got consistency. They follow that program all the way through, and that in turn will ensure that we pave the way for everything that comes later. That continuity, that journey all the way through will also ensure that we haven't left any gaps, and that all adults, as it shows here with consistency, are delivering from the same scheme. So if you've got children that might potentially need to be fast-tracked through the program or put into a lower grouping of the program, that they're getting the same diet regardless of which practitioner is delivering it. So we wouldn't want one delivering Jolly Phonics and then somebody else using strategies from Read, Write, Ink, because all that's going to do is create confusion for the learner. So what I'd like you to do is just spend a minute or two thinking about why do you think it is important to follow just one scheme? And then I'm going to share with you, once you've done that, some of the subtle differences between them. So why do you think just one scheme is important? Why shouldn't we cherry pick? So I'm going to share with you now what I call a progress through word reading chart. It's got some scribbles on, I do apologise, but I do use these. So this is a progress through reading chart that we use for the Letters and Sounds programme for the Department for Education from the DFE in the UK. Some schools use this particular scheme, but it is just one scheme and there are several. Now, as you can see here at the very top, we have oral blending. That's the first step with any phonic program is that the children can distinguish those sounds and orally blend them back together. Down the left-hand side here, we have the order. Now, in letters and sounds, it's grouped into phases. So we have phase 2 sounds, phase 3 sounds, phase 4, which is like your alternative, and then phase 5. The expectation with this scheme is that they know the grapheme, they recognise it. Once they know it, they have to recognise it and know it fluently. So they're recognising that grapheme at speed. Once they know them within here, the expectation would be that if we go to the middle aisle here, that they're blending with those graphemes, again, grouped into their phases. And then along the bottom here, we have the order in which those sounds are taught. So they start with sapin. There's a few that start with sapin, but you can get caught out a little bit because as you go further along the system, some of the sounds are in a different order. Then we've got read, write, ink. Again, that progress through word reading chart. We've got them grouped down the side here, but whereas letters and sounds is grouped into phases, I think there's 6 phases in the full, well, there are 6 phases in the full program. Phase 1 is distinguishing sounds, being able to hear them. That's done differently with read, write, ink, in that they're grouped into sets. So we have set 1 sounds, set 2 sounds, and set 3 sounds. Now the principles down the middle here are very much the same, but the dialogue that's given to the learner, to the child, is very different. So they have oral blending, but many read, write, ink schools, that would be known as what we call Fred talk. They've got a character Fred. I'm really sorry I don't have mine here. It's in a school building, which I can't get access to. Once they've done that oral blending, they would recognise the sound. Then the expectation would be that they would know it, recognise it at speed before blending it together with individual sound cards, which I'll show you a little bit later on, before then progressing onto whole word cards. So the idea would be, I'll just show you a couple of examples. Go to early on. Is that early on they distinguish the individual sounds and they might be put together to form a word. So they would be building it like so. But then they would move onto whole word. So they can look at it, break it up in their heads before reading it out loud. Very similar, well, it is the same principle to letters and sounds. However, if I just draw your attention to the speed sounds down here, they are in fact taught in a different order. It's cumulative, adding one sound after the other, as it is with letters and sounds. But even just early on here, we start with sapin. Read, writing is slightly different, so it starts with a sound. So the order there is different. Very similar, again, this is a different scheme entirely, Floppy Phonics. Floppy Phonics, she works on slightly different principles. As opposed to phases, each of the sounds are broken down into what she calls levels. So in the first instance, again, it would be to know the graphemes within that level, then at speed, before then blending with them. And the order in which we teach them from left to right goes along the bottom here. But again, there's subtle differences here, because whilst we would know the X sound as the letter X, in her system here, she uses the code. So you would have the grapheme, if I just show you. She also teaches it with the following graphemes put together. Now, many of the other schemes, they would have and they're actually 2 individual sounds. But in the Floppy Phonics system, it's slightly different. And the children are taught to look at that and identify it as the x sound. So again, if we mixed systems, that's going to cause a little bit of confusion, or quite a lot. So fundamentally, and the principles, as I said before, they've all got the exact same goal, and that's for children to crack the code. But these systems have been devised really carefully, chunk by chunk. Now, the expectation, as it is here with letters and sounds, if you can see that, is that phase one, that's the ability to hear those individual sounds. You would often do that in nurseries and settings. But once they start reception on entry to school, we should be starting them on phase two of those sounds. Very similarly with Floppy Phonics here. On entry into school, we should be starting with these graphemes on level one, and then with read, write, ink, set one sounds, which are those at the top here. The ability to distinguish those sounds, if they're falling slightly behind, they haven't kept up with that program, is that phase one, distinguishing those sounds, runs alongside. You wouldn't wait till you finish that to move on to the next one, because otherwise you're not going to maintain the pace of the program. And then, as I said before, this is the read, write, ink one. These have all been carefully mapped out, showing you what to teach when. Okay, so by the end of autumn one, the children should be able to do the following, and so on. So these are like your benchmarks as to the system that you have to run through from start to finish. Now, you imagine you've got practitioners delivering in one classroom elements of read, write, ink with Fred, and then in another classroom you've got a teacher using Floppy Phonics, and then in another classroom you've got read, write, ink going on and letters and sounds. What problems could you actually face if you cherry pick from each of those different schemes? What would happen if a child moved to a different room, to a different teacher? What are they going to be faced with? So I'd like you just to jot down a couple of reasons or a couple of problems that you might face. To ensure consistency, we need to make sure that we do not cherry pick. We stick with one. And that's what we mean by fidelity. As I said before, they all lead to the same end goal. So we've just got to make the choice as to which scheme you roll with. So within your setting, okay, we've got to have goals. And the goal is really, if you think of phonics, it is the core to everything. As I said earlier, what we do now on an entry into the education setting in terms of teaching phonics and enabling the children to crack that code, that's going to pave the way for everything else to come. That's going to pave their way to access the other areas of the curriculum and to access wider literature independently. So we need to make sure as a setting that we create a team, what I call a team of experts within our setting, wherever that setting may be. And we want those people that are delivering that phonic teaching to really understand the principles behind systematic synthetic phonics. And also, we want them to be able to teach them confidently. Now, in order to do this, there are many models that I've worked with, but actually, we need to think about what we would call practice sessions. Practice sessions would be that we're not practicing on the children with some of these techniques, whether that might be oral blending, it might be introducing a new sound, it might be introducing and modelling how to blend sounds together or to segment to spell. we need to ensure that our practitioners, our colleagues, feel confident. So we would then practice these together. That's obviously going to require quite a lot of trust within the team. But by doing that and trying it out on each other, we can also then ensure that we've got consistency across our team. So it might be that you have coaching sessions where you think about, what do I need further help with? Let's tweak the way you handle your flashcards, because actually, if I make a name up, Julie, for example, Julie keeps holding her fingers over the grapheme. Now, Julie, let's be honest, the children aren't really going to say that Julie's doing that, whereas a practitioner might ask her to adjust her hands so that she's demonstrating it really clearly. There's many more which I will be sharing with you a little later on. So within your setting, we want to make sure that that phonic teaching is of the highest standard. The systematic synthetic phonics sessions, they need to be right up there. Over time, additional practice, what I mean by that is that we're reducing the number of pupils who aren't accessing it. So rather than playing catch up, we would identify them really swiftly, what we call our spotlight children on the day. Any that did not engage with that sound, or they've got a misconception, they're picked up again later that day and they have an extra repetition. It happens again and again, rather than waiting a week or so and then we've got further catch up. So the motto that we always use is to keep up rather than to catch up. So what I'd like you to think about is which phonic program you currently have in place in your setting. Is it that you use Jolly Phonics and you just use Jolly Phonics? Are you a Letters and Sounds Institute? Do you use Read Writing? What phonic program are you teaching from? Is it that you're actually, as I said before, cherry picking? And if that's the case, we need to think about making the decision and choosing just one. Then I'd like you to just think about what training or development has there been within your setting to ensure that staff have that confidence for the delivery? Has there been any? And then I'd also like you to think about is what the current standard of teaching is within your own setting at the moment. And how do you know it's truly that standard? So just take a couple of minutes for that reflection, and then I'm going to go into the details. Okay, so what is systematic synthetic phonics? Systematic is that it's added cumulatively, one sound after the other, extra additions once they're embedded, bit by bit, chunk by chunk. Synthetic is the pure sound. So in order to read, the child has to read each sound, then they have to blend the sounds, and then they can read the word from left to right. In order to spell for a synthetic system, it would be to say the word, then they would identify each sound within that word, and then in turn be able to write each sound. So systematic synthetic phonics works with what I call a reversibility principle. Building it up to read, breaking it down to spell. What is not synthetic phonics? Learning sight words before sounding them out first. When I say sight words, I knew of a teacher that, for example, had an image, a shape, for the word plane, but that is a really flawed system, which I'll go into in just a minute. It's not synthetic phonics. When we tell the children the word, then ask them to spot the sound. So we've been doing the IGH grapheme, I, and we give them the word light. Which one is the I sound? That is not phonics. It's not synthetic phonics. And also teaching what we call consonant clusters. A couple of consonants grouped together and teaching them on their own, because actually they're individual sounds and which will have been taught, and they can just be blended together. So those things are not synthetic phonics. Now, the problem that we have with what we call sight words is that it is a flawed system, because there are only so many that the human brain would be able to remember by sight. It's going to get trickier the more words you teach. It's also not synthetic phonics when we ask children to work out a word from the picture. So, for example, like you can see here, the cat watched the witch. We know it's that. But if the children haven't come across that grapheme and we ask them to refer to the picture, in essence, we're asking them just to guess the word from the context. And again, that has massive flaws, because there are too many possibilities from the illustration. And again, we're basically asking the child to just guess the word. So a systematic system, we would only expose them to text that they've been taught the graphemes of before building it and decoding it within the sentence. For example, with this one here, I know that that's the cat watched the witch. But actually, if we've referred the learner, the child, to the illustration, there's lots of possibilities here. Because how do we know that the cat is watching the witch? It could be he sat on the witch. Okay? Again, with the next one, the witch dropped a slimy newt into a big cauldron. As we know it, I can decipher that. But if we refer to the illustration, there's no sign of a newt. So it could be anything. It could be soup, it could be liquid, it could be ingredient, it could be any word that they come up with that she's thrown into the cauldron. So again, as I said before, that would be a flawed system, and it is not synthetic phonics. Now, our brains, universally, we learn to decode words from left to right. We're not learning to read a word through its shape or through an image or by the pictures or trying to sight read. We're learning to decode it from left to right, and that's why we use that synthetic phonic approach. So, only with plenty of practice will it become one word. Let's have a look at the word dog here. In the first instance, the learner is breaking that code down into the individual sounds. D-ug, dog, d-ug, dog. Only with plenty of practice of sounding that and then blending it will it become one whole word. So after multiple repetitions and practice, it becomes one chunk here, and then the child is able to transfer that word into the orthographic store. Okay? It can only go into that orthographic store, into the long-term memory after multiple repetitions. So after just one time of building it, dog, that's not going to do it. And that's why we have to do it again and again and again. Multiple repetitions make it a chunk, and then they'll start to make that connection, and then it gets stored. Now, the meaning of the word will develop as they experience it in different forms. So if we have a look at the word cross here, this has a couple of issues really for new learners, young children. In the first word, we've got consonant, vowel, consonant, CVC words, just 3 sounds. But if we look here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So effectively, it requires a little bit more effort for them to blend that together. K, cross, 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 cross. Again, after multiple repetitions, they can then chunk it into one word. And after those multiple repetitions, that can transfer to the orthographic store. However, with the word cross here, it actually has multiple meanings. Is it that they're cross, they're feeling angry? Could it be that they've crossed the bridge, or a cross for being incorrect, or a cross in religion? It has multiple meanings. And the meaning of the word for them here, cross, will develop the more they then experience it in different forms. Okay, common exception words. The expectation is that they can read common exception words, noting unusual correspondences between spelling and sound and where they occur in the word. That sounds a lot trickier than it really is. So common just means that they appear multiple times. They're likely to come across them on the page multiple times. It's a high frequency word. An exception means that the spelling of it is an exception to the rule that they already know. So words only are exception for a while. I'll give you a few examples. So we've got here so, no, and go. Now, the child in the first instance, the earliest stages of their learning journey, will know that as an O sound. So these words here, so, no, and go, they're only what we class as an exception word for a short period of time. Okay, it's only temporary. Once they get through that system, they will then learn that O grapheme here also can be heard as an O sound. Once they know that, these words are no longer an exception word. That is the same for these words here. The E becomes an E on she and we. And the same here. This one is down on an exception word list, but that's because of the split digraph here. So 2 letters, 1 sound has been separated here. Now the next list of words here, I've seen these on a list of what we call common exception words, but actually they are common, but they're not exception, because each of these words here, when we break them down, they're just individual sounds that you can then blend together. There's no reason for this word list here to be taught separately, as long as we've exposed them to each of the individual graphemes. They're fully decodable. So, what does every practitioner need to know about systematic synthetic phonics? Truth of it is, for every learner, that thinking is really hard work. Humans don't think very often because our brains are designed not for thought, but for the avoidance of thought. Thinking is not only effortful, it's also very slow and very unreliable. And that is why I'm going to share with you the following. Children don't learn it from thinking it. They learn something when they can see, feel, meet, attend to, and practice. They need to be able to see the challenge ahead, which is why we put things into chunks. They need to feel that they can do it. They need to meet each challenge in chunks. We wouldn't give them a whole text and say, off you go. It needs to be broken down like it does for adults if we've got a big job to do. They need to be able to pay attention, and they need to be able to practice until it becomes automatic. Automaticity will only come after multiple repetitions. So, to see that challenge ahead, they need to know where they're heading. We make our goals clear. And that's why we have those clear session structures in place. Children and adults, we're actually wired to thrive on that repetition. We don't want any unexpected surprises of how we're going to learn a sound that day or how we're going to learn to blend a particular word. the structure of how we learn to blend that word has got to be the same every day. And that's why you would have clear session structures in place, regardless of what scheme you're on, whether it's read, write, ink, letters and sounds, jolly phonics, they all have a simple system, a simple session structure in place. The reason that happens, okay, is that enables children to feel like they can do it. They haven't got these unexpected surprises. They've got consistency. It's reliable. We want to find that child's Goldilocks spot, the point where it's not too tricky, it's not too difficult, and it's not too easy. Now, in order to find their Goldilocks spot, we've got to make sure that we're accurately aware of their starting point. Which sounds do they know? Which sounds do they not know? Now, dopamine actually motivates children to learn, okay? It increases that motivation. And dopamine in the brain is only released when learners are comfortable. If you've put them too far out of their Goldilocks spot, too far out of their comfort zone, you're not going to get that dopamine release. And that's why we have to make sure that when we're setting up our phonics system and we're delivering it, that it is in short, manageable chunks, okay? We're going to set these children up for success. We're going to set these learners up for success. We want that dopamine release to take place. And it will take place if we make them feel like they can do it. And we do that by meeting the challenge in small chunks. Now, in terms of new learning, we should just be learning one new thing at a time. Okay? We're not going to throw lots of different objectives into one session. The maximum number of stages that a learner is able to retain is actually 4. So if we go beyond those 4 stages, they're not going to retain it at all. The ones that follow number 4, they're just going to be lost and you'd have to reteach them. So always remember it's a maximum of 4 stages that we're introducing. That is why each of the systematic systems that are available are chunked. They're chunked to enable this to happen. There's method behind the madness. The only other time that a child will learn is if they're able to pay attention. They will only get that release, like I said before with the dopamine, if they feel comfortable and when they pay attention. Now, children will pay attention when they can connect to something that they already know. So quite often in a phonics session at the beginning, you would do a review or a revisit or a speed sound recap. And we do that because we need that familiarity of sounds that they've already covered. We've got to keep their attention, short, sharp attention. And that's why our structures have to be so repetitive and so clear. We have to be the children's motivator so that then they want to pay attention. And as I said before, as well as that paying attention, they will only learn something if we practice it until it's automatic. So I want you to think about when we learn an instrument, for example. I did attempt. I wasn't very good. But I think back to learning to play the clarinet, okay? I would go to a lesson on a Tuesday, I think it was. I generally went because I could miss PE if I went to do my clarinet lesson. But anyway, I would go to that lesson and I might be introduced to a new note that day and what position my fingers had to be in, and I would learn to play that note. And I'd leave the session feeling fairly confident-ish on how to play that new note that I'd been taught that day. And then my teacher would say to me, right, between today, Tuesday, and next Tuesday, I want you to go away and I want you to practice every day. And I'll be honest, did I practice? Not really. So I went the following week and it had gone. And the reason it had gone is because I hadn't created that strong neural pathway. I hadn't become automatic playing that note because I hadn't done it again and again. The more you would repeat playing those notes on the clarinet, the stronger the pathways. And then it becomes automatic and I'm ready to learn the next new note. And that's exactly the same with learning to read. The more the learner repeats reading those same sounds, the stronger the neural pathways that develop. They start to make those connections and then they're ready to move on to the next 4 chunks. We're wired to thrive on that repetition. So it's really important that we build in that time in the day to be on the ball with that phonic teaching. We need to make sure that the children, the learners, have ample time to practice, no downtime. We've got the sessions set up right before we go. So any resourcing, it's there ready. Because if we've got that downtime, the concentration is going to wander around the room, it's gone. We don't want any waiting around for the learners. And guarantee we have to have 100% participation. Now, if we have each of those things, we're going to ensure that we build that fluency. We can identify gaps really quickly because there's no hanging around. And then we can also build on the familiar for those children. We're keeping the connection with the children. We're keeping their attention and we're ensuring that they get that practice. We're going to be looking at this in a little bit more detail now. And throughout the session, doesn't matter which area of learning we look at, we're going to be considering how we can ensure that we make connection for the children so that they can connect with something they already know. How we ensure they pay attention and that we really think about what it is we're teaching, and how we can ensure that there is ample practice until it becomes automatic. Making the most of that short, sharp practice until the learner has automaticity. So, why not thinking cap? I had this debate recently actually with a practitioner, and she said, but it's really boring. So I asked a simple question, well, who is it actually boring for? Now, if you get a chance, I really recommend that you look at this article. It's called The 13 Things You Need to Know About Phonics by Claire Seeley. And she says it quite clear here. The lesson isn't meant to entertain the teacher after all. It is meant to develop the child. So whilst it might feel repetitive for you or I doing that delivery, to the child it's brilliant because they're thriving on that repetition and we're setting them up to be successful. We're setting them up to feel like they can really crack the phonic code. So what we're going to look at now is a few different target areas, and then we're going to consider how we ensure that we've got that connection, attention and practice. Now, the first one that we've got on here is responding speedily to the correct sound of graphemes. I think there's 40 plus phonemes, okay? So it's these. So the idea is that when we share that with the child, they're not just recognising it after quite a while, they're recognising them at speed, okay? The speedier they get, the more likely they are then to be able to blend them together to make a word. So, in order to ensure that we've got connection for our learners when doing that, it helps to have a mnemonic. Now, each scheme is slightly different, okay? Now, if I think of these set 1 sounds that I've got here for read, write, ink, they have set pictures on the back. Children can only connect with one. So if we use multiple systems within our school, there's going to be confusion and they can't connect to them. They connect with one. So use the one that you've got for your system. Stick to one mnemonic and use the specific resources that support your scheme. The other thing that's crucial to enforce that connection is that it doesn't matter where the learning is taking place. You might have a phonic group in a corridor, you might have them in the main classroom, you might have them outside, but actually all of those learners must have access to the same standard of resources. So we wouldn't want handmade resources out under the tree, then the lady in the classroom having proper flashcards, different friezes on the wall with different images for each of the sounds. It gets confusing. Just have one and make sure you all have that same one. Also, thinking about all those teachers having the access to the same mnemonics, the same quality resources, okay? Don't confuse these new learners with multiple different resources for one purpose. We've got to make sure that our pronunciation, that we say the sounds close to the children's volume and pitch. So if you change the sound going up and down for each one, okay, they're not going to make that connection. Keep it the same and keep it consistent. Think about as well local dialect. I know I'm obviously from the Midlands in the UK, and in our area here in Walsall and in Birmingham, local dialect can have a huge impact on our pronunciation of those sounds. We've got to make sure that we're clear and concise and using the standard English for those sounds. In order to keep their attention when introducing these new sounds, sit the children where they can all see. So think about it. They must be in the arm line. They must be in the V to C, slightly wider. Any children that are outside that V, they're not going to be able to connect or pay attention to the flashcards that you've got in front of you. And you don't want to be moving from side to side with them. You just want to make sure that they're directly in front of you, okay? And that you can keep your eye on those children. Any children that are struggling to learn these sounds, they must be in your direct line of vision. If they're not, we're going to lose their attention. And also make sure we know what we're doing. Okay, that might seem like an obvious one, but having things ready and make sure we've practiced, not on the children, with the adults. We've got those resources ready and they're in our direct line of vision. What is our goal for that session? We also need to ensure that when we're teaching, we've taught a new sound. Okay, so say for example, we've done that one at the end, so they've already got these. That we then continue to practice using that new sound mixed in with sounds that have previously been taught. Then if they get it right, you might move them further back. Practice saying these sounds, these new graphemes, at plenty of opportunities throughout the day. So not only during the main teaching session, but at different points throughout the day. So it might be that you go armed around with a pack of your flashcards in your pocket, in a pinny, in a belt, whatever works for you, so that you can almost collar the learner and say, right, let's just do a speedy minute now together and let's go back over our sounds. The more repetitions you can get throughout the day, the better. So we're ensuring that teachers make that time on the ball, time to respond to these speedily. So where it might be nice and steady before, can we up that pace to make it quicker? So what I'd like you to think about now, thinking about responding to those graphemes speedily, okay? Think about it. You're teaching that letter sound correspondence. Can you make a list of things that might be a potential barrier for connection, attention, and practice? Just make a list of a couple. Don't worry, I'll share some with you as well. I've gave you one before, and that was mixing the mnemonics, mixing the schemes and the cards. That would be a potential barrier to connection because the child can't connect with more than one. So what else might be a barrier? Just make a note of a couple, and then I will share some with you. Potential barriers. Excuse me. Okay, so I'll share some more with you as well. You can add them to the list. So a barrier for connection would be mixing the mnemonics, as I've said before, using really complicated stories about the letter sound correspondence. Just keep it simple. Using too many games with too many instructions. Primarily, we just want them to recognise that grapheme. So if they're fishing for it in sand, we need to ask ourselves, activity-led, which is distracting from the skill of just recognising it on the page. The other potential barrier for this one would be the pronunciation of the sound as well, and telling really long stories. So having that clutter as well in the classroom. Have we got lots of different phrases stuck on the wall and different alphabets and all of those things? What purpose are they having? Does it match the scheme that we're using? If not, it's going to stop that connection. Another potential barrier for attention would be allowing the children to just sit in a large circle. Again, that doesn't work because actually children that are nearer you in the circle aren't going to see those cards when you're handling them clearly. They need to be in your sight. So in the V to C, apart from spotlight children that need to be directly in front of you. Another barrier for attention is just homing in on individual children to read those sounds in the class, when actually we need all of them engaging. You will know which children don't have it. You don't need to be looking at our cards because they're going to come behind anyway. And if they don't have that sound, there's going to be a slight echo between. And because they're in front of you, you'll be seeing that hesitation with some potential children. And also a huge barrier for practice is moving those cards too slowly, when actually we want them to be doing it at speed, covering the graphemes without realising, moving them around, gets their heads all over. Keep it forward, keep it straight, keep it sharp. Okay. The next target area that we're going to have a think about is to sound blend words. Children need to do two things to read a word. They need to be able to read their sounds speedily, and then they need to be able to put them together. They need to be able to blend them. Now, many schemes use many different systems, but those individual sounds here eventually have to become this. And we do that through blending. Now, if you're Floppy Phonics, they've got a dog character for one of their systems. Letters and sounds, they use robot arms for blending. And read, write, ink, it's Fred in your head. It's the same thing, really. We recognise the sounds, we already blend them, and then we put them together to read the word. Just use one. Don't mix them. Use whichever one it recommends in your scheme during the lesson and throughout the day. So, in order to ensure connection, the children, in order to connect, must connect those sounds in familiar words. They must be able to say the words into different sounds back and forth, repeating again and again. Say the sounds, not too fast so that you can't blend them, too quickly, but again, not too slow. There's too much of a gap for them then to blend it. And the other thing to ensure that connection is that they can hear themselves saying that sound. So if you've got multiple distractions around you, That's not going to happen. They're not going to make that connection if they can't hear themselves say that sound. Again, the same as when we're teaching an individual grapheme, when we want them to blend them, they've got to be in a position in the room where they can all see you. So think about the setup that you've got in your current setting. Ensure that those children that we would class as spotlight children that are maybe struggling a little bit are in your direct line of vision, so that when you're blending those sounds together, you can see any errors that they've got. And again, know what we're doing. Think about the words that we're going to blend today during that session. The children must have plenty of opportunities to orally blend within the phonics session. So, for example, excuse me, we would need to look for multiple opportunities, multiple repetitions to build that word orally, then teacher scaffolding in front of them, then the children building it themselves and repeating. So make sure we've got plenty of oral blending. Now, if I know, for example, that I'm going to be building the word mad, I would be orally blending that with them first. So it might be mad, 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 their turn. Mad, mad, their turn. Mad, mad, your turn. So you're keeping your instruction to a minimum. You don't even just use your hand. But allow that oral blending to take place. But also, not only in the session, but thinking about how you might do that during the day. So it could be, oh, I need to put my coat on, coat, and get them to copy and to do the same. So make sure that you're building in that practice. So for connection, children hearing the sounds, back and forth, where they can see you, so know which words you're going to blend, and then making sure that there's plenty of time for practice. My turn, your turn, my turn, your turn. Do it orally, but build the words with the cards as a scaffold, as a teacher, then let the children read them as well, again and again and again. So what I'd like you to think about now are potential barriers for connection, attention, and practice for blending those words. They're very similar to when we do the first one. Maybe make a note of a couple of barriers. It could be that you have large numbers of children or learners in your room, which means that they then can't hear themselves blending those words. And think about how we might provide a solution for that. So I'll share a couple with you, which you can jot down. Potential barriers for connection might be trying to blend the sounds too quickly or too slowly. Another potential barrier is that we don't check the sounds that children are finding really tricky to pronounce. Potential barriers for attention, that they can't see your mouth when you are blending. Another potential barrier for attention is that not all of the children are joining in. So it's really important, it's almost like choral, that they're joining in with you. And if they're in a really noisy environment where they can't hear very well and they're going to get easily distracted, that would be a barrier for their attention for this target. A potential barrier for practice is that you're just not providing enough opportunity. So if they're only blending once or twice a week, that's not going to do it. They need it every single day. And even if you're just looking at 2 words, you would do that one word several times. Keep thinking of those repetitions until it becomes automatic and we've got the word in a chunk. They can then transfer it to their orthographic store. So frequency is really critical. Okay, our next target area is then reading the whole word. Not building it with the individual sounds, but we've got the whole word. And it must contain the graphemes that they've previously been taught. So, connection. They've got to connect with sounds that they already know. It's no good us giving them words that have got graphemes with many words that have got graphemes that they've never come across before. Think about the order of our teaching. If we've only got so far, we've got to build words that have the correct sounds. We should also only use words with sounds that they can really do speedily. So if it's a brand new sound and they're a lot slower, we wouldn't be going on to the whole written word just yet. And we've got to make sure that we link that oral blending with the printed word. For example, black, 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 black. So we're repeating it again and again, almost modelling yourself as the learner too. Always works. So how are we going to keep their attention? Make sure that your eyes, when you're getting them to do it, are on the child and not on the card. You only want a couple anyway, 3 or 4. That's more than a couple, I know, but 3 or 4. So we wouldn't be looking to see what word we've got and written down. We want to keep our eyes on them all of the time when we're sliding those cards. Again, if they haven't got it, you'll hear the difference between those children or that slight delay. Think about as well how we hold the cards. So if they're in front of us here, if they're too low down in our lap, can they see them if we're moving them around? Think about the eye line of those children depending on your position in the room. And also make sure that the children are looking at those words. They're not getting distracted around the room and just shouting out what they hear their peers shout out. Practice. So you would read the word that we've been focusing on. Well, let's go with that one. Okay, we keep practicing with that word. But then we make sure that we put it in with a pile of words, like I did earlier, that they already know. So you would repeat it then, again and, oh, there's our focus, again and again, to build that speed and embed and transfer it to the orthographic store. The more they read it, the more quickly that will happen. So think about, we're teaching them the whole word, we're reading those whole words for that target area. What might be potential barriers for connection, attention, and practice? See if you can jot a couple down. And then I'll share a couple more with you as well. Okay, so potential barriers for connection. Asking the children to read words, but exposing them to letter sounds in there that they've not yet been taught. Seems obvious, I know, but it does happen. Or no connection. Always sounding out the word first so the children don't have to work. Make them do some of the work in their heads. You might do it for the first couple of words that you're using with them, but maybe this following 2, you're getting them to sound it out first. Make sure it's not you doing it all. They've got to be doing it. Using different ways of teaching them how to read that word. Let's make sure that we keep the routines exactly the same every single time. So the routine would be the same for teaching a new sound. The routine would be the same for building and blending a word. The routine should be the same for reading the whole word. Another barrier to consider is that we model blending those sounds too quickly or too slowly. Another potential barrier to consider for attention is allowing them to sit where they can't really see that word. So if they're here, they're not going to see it. It's got to be directly in their eye line. Check their eyesight. Are they close enough to you? Are they too far away? If they're further away, is the font size big enough? And another potential barrier is that we don't plan enough practice time for them to access those words. If we've got games where it requires them taking it in turns, like bingo or fishing the words out from the water tray or the sandpit, that kind of thing, we're actually decreasing the number of repetitions they get. So just keep it sharp and keep it simple. Okay. So the expectation really, if we really want them to move forward, is that every day, every learner, regardless of their age, is taught word reading, opportunity for handwriting and spelling. That if we can, we provide them with books that they can read that have got the known sounds in, no new ones thrown in, just the sounds they've been taught from the phonic programme. And then to have a go at writing sentences with those known sounds. Now, this is for the UK, but this would be transferable ideally. Now, bear in mind, in the UK, they start quite a bit younger in reception, they're 4 turning 5. In that kind of first 2 to 3 months of being in the school setting, you would be expecting them to have phonic instruction for around 20 minutes every day. As they move into the kind of next chunk of time, over here it's in the spring term, but the next kind of 3 months of learning, you would want to increase that to around 30 minutes per day. And as they're towards the end of that first year of education, around 45 minutes. Now, that might be in one big go, or you might separate it into little chunks throughout the day, but that would be the ideal model. What I'd like you to do is to just think about how that might work in your setting. It might be different. It might be that they don't come to school Monday to Friday every single day. And if that's the case, if they're only coming 2 to 3 times a week, could it be that they're having that kind of phonic instruction twice a day, for example? So think about how you would increase those repetitions. Just make a few notes of what that might look like. I know I chatted to somebody the other day, and theirs is quite different because it might be that they're after lockdown starting in August, for example. So that would be August through until the end of kind of October that we're expecting that 20 minutes a day. And then October to December, starting to increase the amount of minutes per day of teaching. It will all depend on your setting and how that's organised. But the more we can increase those repetitions and that frequency, the more we're going to create automaticity so that they can read that code, they can crack that code, and then begin to access other areas of the curriculum. A couple of do's and don'ts really, just from my perspective, is keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Quite often we try to create all these fancy games for phonic delivery, but what it boils down to is that we want them to recognise those sounds. We want them to build them together to make a word with those sounds. Do it the right way. We want them to read it in a word, and then we also want them to access it on a sentence level as well, so in decodable books, that kind of thing, and then spelling. So think about the system of the structure of your session, sorry. To begin with, I know it's not very clear on here, but you would want some sort of kind of revisit or review model, recapping on sounds that you've taught in previous days. Some teaching time. Is it that it's going to be blending? Is it going to be that you're just teaching a new sound? Is it a spelling focus session? What is it you want them to be doing? Opportunity for the children to apply that skill. But again, keep it simple. If we're creating an abundance of worksheets, are we actually hitting that area when we want them to blend it? So give them a book, do some paired reading. And then to finish off with that assessment. And that would be an observation. So which sounds did they not get that day? What did they find tricky? What am I going to do tomorrow? Now, ordinarily with this, I normally do a second day where we home in on the actual nitty-gritty, the teaching side of things. But I'll have a chat with Megan on that, I think, to see if we've got opportunity to do that at a later date. So before I go and say bye to all of you, I know that was a very whistle-stop tour. As I said, it's normally a couple of days of 2 full days of training on phonic teaching. I want you to think about what you can take from today. Was there any information in there that you weren't yet familiar with? Some of you might have been very familiar with phonic teaching. Was it that you hadn't come across connection, attention, and practice? And is that something that might influence your future phonic teaching? But also think about where your strengths currently lie as a practitioner. Do you need further development? Do you need more time to practice some elements of your delivery? And if so, is that something that you could be setting up with colleagues so that you practice together? Think about your strengths and think about where you need further development. Just make a few notes. And once you've made those notes, I'm going to say thank you. That will be the end. Oh, that's gone quickly. The end of our webinar today. I will stay online for about 10-15 minutes or so. So if you do have any questions, just pop them into the chat here for me. And I believe there will be a feedback. Yes, it's already in there in the sticky note. So if you could fill in a feedback form for us, that would be really helpful because that might inform future webinars as well. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. And thank you for listening to me for such a length of time again. So don't be afraid. If you do have any questions, just drop them in here. I'll hang around for about 10 minutes or so. Definitely. Low literacy.